Hey there, and welcome to Utah. It's a show where we connect with people across Canada and ask them about their stories, cultures, and experiences. I'm your host, Ryan Funk. If I tell you the word diaspora, what comes to mind? I know for myself, I had never heard of it before. Well, a diaspora is a scattered group of people coming from a different geological location. Scholars break them into two categories: voluntary and forced. Whatever the reason, it's natural disasters, looking for new opportunities, or something very relevant today, a war-torn country. Diasporas have many stories to tell, and many of them have very similar experiences. Today, let's learn about diasporas. We'll first look at a podcast from the Zorian Institute called Dispersion, where they connect with different diasporas and talk to them about their experiences and stories, and to find those similarities between groups. We'll also then jump into a story that is relevant to myself: the migration of Mennonites. And to do that, we'll talk with Conrad from the Mennonite Heritage Archives. Let's get into it. Podcasts are a fun way to pass the time. Whether on a long drive or doing chores at home, what you can learn is excellent. A new podcast by the Zorian Institute is taking a deep dive into the stories of diaspora, their diverse and shared experiences of living away from and returning to their homelands. Host of the Diaspora podcast, Jen Haddo, shares what you can expect from the 6-episode series.
I'm Jen Haddo. I'm the host of the Zorian Institute's podcast Dispersion. I worked full-time with the Zorian team for almost 2 years in Toronto, and we kind of cooked this idea up during that time. I've since left being there full-time, but I was so lucky to stay on and do the podcast and kind of teeter around with a couple of other things. Yeah, so it's been really fun, and I'm proud of it and excited it's out and ready to share it with the world.
Podcasts are just so nice. Like whether you're like cleaning up around your apartment or the home or going for a ride somewhere, it's so nice to just pop on a podcast. And there's so much, like whether it's on Spotify or like Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, that you could find almost anything.
For anyone, right? I mean, commuting, maybe not so much of a thing for lots of us these days. My commute is about 4 steps. But I know commuting, when I was on the subway or the bus, podcasts would have been great. Like just plug them in, kind of, and you can learn. I know friends of mine, people in my life, like are learning kind of real life skills or niche interests. There's something for everybody, truly. And that's what we're hoping for Dispersion as well, is it is expanding an audience and that it's new for people. Like fully, we don't expect this to be something people are aware of. And personally, I'd love for someone to have no idea what any of it is about and tune in one day and think like, you know what? Yeah, I learned a little tidbit. I'm happy at that point.
What exactly is the Zorian Institute?
So the Zorian Institute is a nonprofit organization. As I said, it is based in Toronto currently, but it is an international. Really, when you boil it down, it seeks to raise awareness on issues related to genocide, human rights, and the diaspora homeland relations. So those are the three kind of core tenets that it focuses on. And methodology-wise, and how we do that is through research, lots and lots of research, documentation, lectures, seminars that became webinars during the pandemic, which was great. Tools, journals, we have journals, and now a podcast. So it's been around since 1982. It started in the United States in 1984 in Canada, and more recently in Armenia in 2020. So 2 years ago now, which seems like it's going by really fast.
These last 2 years have kind of felt a little bit like an enigma. It just kind of all blends.
Blur. I know.
Together.
Yeah.
Yeah, but those are some really important topics to talk about. You know, as we're seeing very topical, you know, the issues that we're seeing between Russia and Ukraine right at the moment.
Absolutely.
It's very important to have these conversations.
As we deal with these issues of genocide, human rights, diaspora, homeland relations, what I like is that in studying them and working with them, they do all complement each other. So you can't talk about one without talking about the other. And really the talking is where this podcast was birthed. We would talk about these things in the office, all learning between the staff. And one day we're just thinking, you know, it would be great if we were able to share this with a broader platform, make it much more accessible and digestible, because as you said, these issues are not things of the past. They're very much in our future and in our lives these days. And people are interested, and we have these vehicles through technology and through our ever-growing virtual world to learn more about it. So in the first season, we really wanted to navigate the question of home. So what is home to different people? Identity, which is just a big one. There's so much there. And the idea of belonging as well, which firmly places those three inside of the diaspora experience. I'm sure we'll get into what the diaspora is in a minute. I'm jumping ahead of myself and trying to build the suspense. But yeah, that was really what we focused on. So we interviewed some amazing Canadians, or kind of people living in Canada now, and we talked to them about just their experiences. So really it's anecdotal. That's what it is, or as I like to call it, anecdata. So it's people's lived experiences, but it all roots itself in the theory of what the Institute does and kind of the academic, and based on the journal. So the Institute has had an academic journal in diaspora studies for 30 years. So a bit more high level academic, and we really wanted to bring this conversation to a new platform.
I was just thinking that, like, it can be really hard to read scientific journals with all the data and the research behind it. So a podcast is just the perfect platform to get to that broader audience.
Reading these articles in the journal as part of just our day-to-day actions and thinking, this is really cool, but it took me a week to get to this point and understand what this is saying. How we can't expect everyone to have time to read an academic journal, but these things are worthy of discussion. And worthy of those conversations about the diverse communities in Canada. And we wanted to celebrate those in, just like you said it, in a way that doesn't just give you a brain scramble as soon as you look at it. And I think we've achieved that, which is really exciting.
The big question is, what exactly is diaspora? I've heard the word before, but when Megan brought it up, I was like, what is that again?
What is this? Yeah. Quickly Googles. And you know what? I'm right there with you. Before I started working at the Institute, despite having a background in kind of history and conflict studies, and I'd heard it come up, I couldn't have pinpointed what it was. So definitionally, diaspora is the movement, the migration, sometimes referred to as the scattering of people away from an established or an ancestral homeland. So it started with some kind of core diasporas. The Jewish diaspora is usually the one cited the most when we think about how many times the Jewish diaspora has resettled in kind of homelands. That's a good example. But what's really exciting about diaspora studies is it's moving forward and it's up to date. So we see diasporas everywhere now. So essentially it's someone who's immigrated or migrated or been displaced from their homeland community and has come to a host land. And I'm exaggerating those terms because they come up a lot in the podcast. Those are kind of our two bases, the homeland and the host land.
Why is it important? I mean, we've talked a little bit about it, but why is it important to have this podcast, and what can people expect when listening to these episodes?
When we think about Canada, and all of these episodes are based on people who are Canadian, who identify as Canadian or reside in Canada. So we kept it to a Canadian context because of Canada's unique, multicultural, diverse approach, or kind of the reality that we're with. We wanted to celebrate, we being based in Toronto, obviously the Institute is in the midst of what is an incredibly diverse city. You've got food. I have never seen more different cultures represented in food in cities in the world. So we really wanted to bring that to people. And my favorite part about why we wanted to do this is we wanted to identify the similarities and experiences between very differing diaspora communities. So, take the Ethiopian diaspora and the Ukrainian diaspora. On paper, first glance, you might think, I'm sure they've got nothing in common, right? Very different geographic locations and cultures and food and language. But when you get two people from those diasporas, or any two, in a room and you start having these conversations, you have these amazing moments of like, yeah, I went through that too, or really, you experienced that? And that's really what we wanted to get at. And we wanted to have it in a podcast form so people could listen to it. We could challenge some of the stereotypes and the discrimination that unfortunately faces people in diasporic communities in Canada on a huge scale. And we just really wanted to bring people together and have those conversations.
So are the guests for these episodes taken directly from the journals, or how did you find these individuals?
That is a good question, and one we went back and forth on so often. We thought maybe we'd have kind of more of an academic focus, but again, in the nature of making this really accessible, these are just everyday incredible Canadians or people who live in Canada. So the Institute, having been around since the 80s, has a really fantastic network. It has a university level program, the GHRUP, the Genocide Human Rights University program that it runs in the summer, which has churned out some incredible scholars and practitioners. So we pulled on them a lot, and they'll come up. We pulled on just network connections of people we had. And people related to the Institute that represent a diaspora community or friends of friends of friends, really leveraged the network, which was incredible because, again, we were drawing on people's similarities and trying to bring this community together. So to answer your earlier question of what can people expect, so me as the host and two fantastic guests. We always had two, again, to facilitate this conversation. I'm trying to think, how many instances did they previously know each other? Not many. So we had two kind of complete strangers, sometimes coming from different parts of Canada, coming to talk about the same questions. So we asked them the same questions and they chip in. They can exchange with one another and again have these moments of like, I can't believe you experienced that too. I did as well. Like just the best moments when that comes up. Yeah. So, and through it all, we weave this thread of teaching you about or helping you to understand better what a diaspora is, how they're formed, how they operate within Canada, and kind of some of the terminology as well, so people can dig deeper if they're interested.
How many episodes are currently available, and are there plans for a season 2?
At the moment, there are 7 episodes in our first season, 6 of which include guests, and then the 7th is the staff. So it's not just me. I don't do this alone. I have a fantastic team with the rest of the Institute, and I managed to convince them to come on for an episode. And it's our wrap-up episode. So we go over our favorite moments of the season and what we'd like to see for an inevitable season 2, which we're really hoping. And we have so many ideas. I think if anything that came out of the first season, it's we really tipped just the tip of the iceberg, more so than we envisioned. So lots more themes we want to look at. I personally want a whole episode on food. And I've been saying this. Yeah, okay, good. I have your support. I've been saying this since this conception of this podcast, because I think food is very central to bringing people together in the same way that music is. So definitely hopes for a season 2, representing some very different diasporas than we've seen this season. And just delving a little bit deeper into equipping people with the knowledge of the importance of just sitting down with someone and connecting over lived experiences that are often similar.
I know you're not with the Institute anymore, but do you know if there's any like upcoming projects or programs that are coming down the works?
I do, some exciting ones. I'm lucky enough that I still stay very up to date with what the Institute's doing. So actually 2022, so this year is the 40th anniversary of the Institute.
Nice.
So the big 4-0. So lots in the works. So obviously the podcast has been a big goal for us, especially because of just pivoting, as every organization has had to because of the pandemic. So plans to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the journal that Dispersion is based on, looking into how we can move forward with those in a really interactive and exciting way. As I mentioned before, the Genocide and Human Rights University program, which has been going on for, I'm probably going to get this wrong, but at least 18 years, which brings in scholars and helps educate them, will be taking place online this year. So lots of interesting things. I would definitely say, if you don't already follow the Institute on any social media platform, absolutely get on that. Really, really cool stuff.
So where can people go to listen to this podcast and find out more about the Institute?
So to find out more about the Institute, you can visit the website. So it's www.zoryan.institute. Zoryan is Zoryan, and that's a bit of a tricky one. So there's a whole page on the website about the guests, about the episodes, and more about the podcast itself, and even more about the journal if you are academically inclined and want to dig into some of the more meaty theories behind diaspora studies. The podcast itself is on Spotify, it's on Apple Podcasts, and it's on Google Podcasts. And it's also on Acast. And Acast is fantastic if you haven't used it because it has show notes. So we plug in loads of data there, articles, resources, URLs, if you want to learn more about things that came up in that specific episode.
When you mentioned that, I was like, that is such a great component. Like having the data right there at the side when you're talking about something, you're like, here's all the things. Like, man, that's a powerful tool right there.
Super helpful if you're in the middle of an episode and we are name dropping a theory or just a concept that you're not familiar with. The show notes has loads of information, links to articles, links to previous work the Institute's done. As you said, it's very educational. That is a huge focus of the Institute. So there's free resources on the website about a number of different topics, not just diaspora studies. Yes, so show notes, if you're looking to read, I would definitely say find it on Acast. But if you're a Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts fan, they're all up there live as of a few days ago.
So what was your favorite episode?
That's really difficult. I do love the first episode. So the first episode, spoiler alert, is called Uprooted, which you have to listen to the episode to understand why. But really, it's about defining diaspora. So it's about the concept. It's setting the stage for the rest of the season. And it was just a fascinating episode. Really interesting perspectives. The two guests we had on all our guests were incredible. And every time I got off recording, I was like, wow, I feel like I just had a really fantastic conversation. And then I also did love the wrap-up episode because I got to bring the team on who were kind of in the behind the scenes. And put them in the hot seat a little bit and hear what they have to say. So yeah, I'd say the first and the seventh, but I have to give a shout out to my favorite title of an episode, which is the Putin in Portugal episode. Ooh. And again, you have to listen to that one to understand where the connection is. But yeah, that's my favorite title for sure.
When you live in Winnipeg, it may seem like Manitoba is a city province. Once you head past that perimeter, you quickly realize a lot of southern Manitoba is farmland. Let's take a deep dive into one group of early farmers, the Mennonites. We have Conrad from the Mennonite Archives to share their history with us.
My name is Conrad Stace, and I'm the archivist at the Mennonite Heritage Archives on the campus of Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg.
So I guess the important question is, what are the Mennonite archives? What were they? When were they established? And what, as an archivist, what do you do there?
These particular archives were established here in Winnipeg in 1933. They were created out of a sense of loss, actually. There was a Mennonite archive in Russia, and in the mid-1920s, it was confiscated by the secret police. And this archive was an attempt to start over. So today, our archive responds to over 100 requests for information a month. If you stack all our paper on top of each other, it's higher than the CN Tower. So it's over half a kilometer high, 600 meters of materials that we have. And we have all sorts of people that come to our archive to use this material. We have scholars, genealogists, family historians, lawyers, documentary filmmakers, journalists, a whole slew of people coming using the archive to answer important questions.
Yeah, it's one of those things you never know you need it until you're doing a project like that.
Yeah, often archives kind of spring up out of this anniversary events, or people want to tell a story and they realize, well, where are these documents? Where are these stories? And so then they spend time collecting the materials. They write their project, write their book, and then what are we going to do with this material? Well, we should start an archive. Is often how things like this start.
And I think it's just so interesting, like the history of Mennonites, and we'll go into a little bit more detail, but just exploring some of these museums out in like the prairie communities, like the Miami Museum and other things like that. It is just so interesting seeing like life of what these early immigrants and farmers was like. So the important question, who were the early Mennonites that first came here to Manitoba?
Mennonites grew out of the Protestant Reformation in Western Europe in the 1500s. There was a man by the name of Menno Simons who became a leader in this Protestant group. His followers were called Mennonites after Menno Simons. Many were from Dutch, German, Swiss background. They were a Christian group who believed in nonviolence. They believed that baptism and becoming a member of a church happened as an adult. It didn't happen earlier. And the importance of community in church making decisions, that all voices had a right to be heard. And for some of these beliefs, they weren't always welcome in different parts of Europe, so they moved around a lot. And the first Mennonites went to Russia in 1789. And then about 100 years later, in the 1870s, laws were changing in Russia and now in what is Ukraine. The Russian government wanted more control over schools, and they wanted to revoke the exemption from military service that was promised to the Mennonites. So some Mennonites started looking for, okay, so what are our options? And a delegation was sent out to North America in 1873, and they checked out Manitoba. And the Canadian government wanted more people in the province. They wanted farmers. Treaty 1 had been signed. And so the government produced a document, this document here,
nice.
in 1873, that highlighted and laid out, if you guys come to Manitoba, this is what you get. This is our promises. This is kind of our contract with you. And in there was land and help settlement. But for the Mennonites, what was really important was exemption from military service, and they could control their own schools. Those are very important things. So about a third of the Mennonites left Russia in the 1870s. 10,000 went to the United States, but 7,000 came to Manitoba because of this letter, because of the exemption from military service, and because of they could run their own schools. Mm-hmm. And so 2 parcels of land was set aside for their settlement, their exclusive settlement. So one on the east side of the Red River in the Steinbach area, it was called the East Reserve, little creative name. Mm-hmm. And the other settlement was in the Altona-Winkler area, the West Reserve, west side of the river. And the first few years were very difficult. But after the first few years, early they had to deal with early frost and too wet conditions. And so farming was really difficult getting going. After that, they started to really flourish and expand. And they grew out of those reserves and moved around the province, and you start moving to Saskatchewan and Alberta. Then during World War I, Canada was at war with Germany. Mm-hmm. The Canadian government honored their promise of exemption from military service, but the Canadian public was not very happy with the way the Mennonites were not supporting the war effort the way that they thought they should. And as a way of making Mennonites more patriotic, the governments in Saskatchewan and Manitoba introduced compulsory attendance for schools. So Mennonites had to send, well, not just Mennonites, anybody in the province had to send their children to government-run schools. So the ability to run their own schools was taken away. Mm-hmm. And the government wanted more obedient citizens, and they thought education was the way to do this. Some Mennonites thought, okay, we can work with this. We'll find other ways of creating and instilling values in our community. Some resisted. And so those who resisted and didn't send their kids to school, they were jailed, they were fined, they even had farm machinery, animals, even food confiscated. So in Saskatchewan alone, there were over 4,500 prosecutions of these families that wouldn't send their kids to public school because they said, government, you promised us that we could run our own schools. Well, this went on, and so finally, this group that was resisting mm-hmm. said, this isn't working for us. Canada's not a good place for us. And so 7,000 moved to Mexico and Paraguay, starting in 1922, 100 years ago this year. And so that's how those communities in Latin America first got started. So these people are moving out starting in 1922, but the Russian Revolution has happened in Russia, and that's created a lot of upheaval. So between 1923 and 1930, you have a second wave of migration of Mennonites into Manitoba from Russia. So 20,000 come to Canada between 23 and 1930. Another group, another wave post-World War II come. And then, like you were saying, people in the 1990s started coming back from Mexico and Paraguay to Manitoba. And then another complicating or factor is that you start having people coming out of Europe in the 1990s to Canada. So yeah, there's a lot of moving around and happening.
The most interesting is like based on the history of like, some Mennonites had to be like assimilated within the government run school systems, especially like out in Winkler, Altona, the Pembina Valley region. You can definitely see the cultural differences between people who were, put through the government schools and then people coming over now. There's very difference between at least those European Mennonites.
Yeah, the Mennonites today in southern Manitoba or around the province, there's a large variety. There are over 42 denominations in Canada, Mennonite denominations in Canada, about 150,000 adult members in Canada, not counting kids. And some Mennonites, you can tell that they're Mennonites by the way they dress, and others you can't. In Manitoba, Calvin Gertson was our first Mennonite premier. And we have Mennonites sitting in Headingley Penitentiary. They're around the province. They're doctors, lawyers, truck drivers, carpenters, bakers, a variety of people today.
When you're talking about like the different denominations of Mennonite, like I know a joke often told out in the Pembina Valley is, when you disagree with someone, you just start a new church.
Yeah, you put 4 Mennonites in a room and you get 5 opinions.
It's definitely a very diverse group, and it's like changed a lot over the years, specifically through missions trips. We see Mennonites all over the world now.
What I've talked about is people who have a European background, but yeah, there have always been people coming into the Mennonite community and leaving, and joining the Mennonite community for appreciating their values and how they run church. And so, yeah, there's a large Mennonite population around the world today, in part because of mission work, but also just people being in the community wanting to join the church.
I know there can often be a little confusion around, Mennonites is like, oh, is this a culture thing? Is this a religious thing?
Yeah, it's difficult to give a short answer to that question, and people, really debate that. And in my mind, there's, kind of 3 categories. There's the faith category, there's the culture category, and another category that is both. So there are people who self-identify as Mennonite because the church they attend or the values they hold. This can include people who are relatively new to the church or people who have long-standing roots in the church. Then there are people who value the culture but don't have any church affiliation anymore, but they enjoy maybe some of the food and folkways, maybe they even speak this Mennonite Low German language. And then there's people kind of who have a foot in both camps, who are both. They attend a Mennonite church and they have a long-standing appreciation of the Mennonite culture in the Mennonite community. And so, yeah, it's both culture and faith. And it's to people trying to figure it out at the beginning, it can be kind of confusing.
But I guess it's kind of in that aspect where, there was an established culture in the beginning when it was just forming, kind of taking those European influences. But since then, it's evolved.
Yeah, and it has evolved, and it will keep evolving.
Yeah, it'll keep changing.
And in Manitoba, it keeps changing every time there's a new migration group that comes in, or there's a new, people joining from within the province already. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So what can we learn about the history of Mennonites? Because it's something you don't often hear about in school. Like even out in the Pembina Valley, they don't, unless you're taking a Mennonite studies class, they don't really talk about, these mass migrations of people who help establish the farming communities around there.
Yeah, I think it would be great to have a class or even a whole course on Mennonite migration in our school system. That would be really good. So what can we learn? I think one of the things is the power of community. The early years it was the communities that were fundamental to establishing lasting settlements on the open prairie. They had to rely on each other. These communities have established organizations to help people around the world. You have Mennonite Central Committee, Mennonite Disaster Service. They go around the world where there's a disaster, a hurricane or a tornado or earthquake or a flood, and they go and help people rebuild. Mennonite Economic Development Associates is another one, Canadian Food Grains Bank. And for a small community like the Mennonite community, they've really done a lot in helping others. And another thing about community is you need a community to maintain a culture.
Mhm.
That's really important. Another thing we can learn is that not just from the Mennonite community, but since we're talking about Mennonites, Canada did not always have and did not always value multiculturalism. For some time, it was difficult to be different, and the process or the underlying assumption was to fit into a certain kind of mold in what you believed and how you talked and these types of things. And so some of the Mennonites resisted this, and because they were part of a community, they could resist. On your own, it's much more difficult. So that's another thing to learn from the Mennonite experience. And Mennonites have really valued peace and nonviolence. That's been a big value for them, and that's something that they've brought also to the Canadian context.
The multicultural aspect, yeah. Before it's like you had English-speaking Canada, and French-speaking Canada. If you didn't fall into either of those categories, yeah, you were an outsider. And I love seeing how it's developed multiculturalism, because it's so fun to go around and learn about other people's cultures, and just the food aspect. And I think that's definitely something Mennonites can bring to the table in terms of multiculturalism. Those foods. I know they're not for everyone, but man, like a good zummerborscht.
I love zummerborscht. Yeah, and so everywhere the Mennonites have gone, they've kind of picked up food and folkways from where they're living, and they've kind of adapted it. And so, for example, one of the earliest ones is the Mennonite New Year's cookies called it's parcheltje.
Okay, I don't think I've had that, but Rockuk and I I know that.
Parcheltje is like a fried raisin fritter, and they picked it up when Mennonites were living in the lowlands in the Netherlands. So the Dutch people, they create what they call oliebollen, which is a fried raisin fritter that they create for New Year's Day. And so the Mennonites have carried on that tradition to this day. And so, New Year's Eve, I was making parcheltje in my home, and there were Mennonites in Latin America, and there were Dutch people in Holland making the same thing. And so they picked up these foodways and kind of adopted them. Zommerborscht, Kamsborscht, Veranetje, all these things. I love them.
Like Mennonite foods can really be just a staple of kind of like world foods, kind of like put into one group a little bit.
Yeah.
We got pierogies like from Ukraine and Russia.
Right. And so Mennonite dough pockets, we call them Veranetje, have cottage cheese in them. Mm-hmm. And the Ukrainian pierogies often will have potato and cheese, potato and bacon, those types of staples. Whereas I grew up having just the cottage cheese, and later on some people started putting fruit.
Blueberries, like kind of dessert. Cottage cheese pierogies, they're like my favorite, with some schmofat put over top of it.
Yeah, cream gravy.
What is it? There's like, I can't remember the name of it, but for like waffles or pancakes, white sauce. Yep. That's good too.
Yeah,
I'm a bad Mennonite. I don't remember most of the name.
Yeah, I've asked people what do they call that white sauce, and people just say either white sauce, or there's one family that called it schmagus, and I don't know if that's right or not. But instead of having syrup, it was a way of making a sweet syrup out of the waffle dough, with added sugar and stuff, and then you would pour it onto the waffles.
Yeah, I remember going to a friend's house, and he's like, "Oh, here, try this." And I'm like, "What is this? I've never seen it before." I guess it's just so interesting. Yeah, the different involvement in Mennonite culture that different individuals have. Like my upbringing wasn't too much. There's some, but maybe I'd like to see a little bit more. Maybe I'll try exploring, my Mennonite heritage a little bit once everything is settled down a little bit. But what is your favorite Mennonite meal? Or
I have so many. One of my favorite comfort foods would be Kamsborscht, which is a cabbage borscht. So in Ukrainians, the way I understand it, would make a beet borscht, but this is made with cabbage and tomatoes. I really enjoy that. But my all-time favorite is the cottage cheese Veranetje, cottage cheese pierogies. With some ham and some cream gravy. That's my ultimate favorite.
That's a classic meal for like your grandma to make for everyone to come over for supper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, when we go to my parents' place, and my kids always want to have Verdaniki, grandma and grandpa's.
hmm Well, since you work in an archive, what sort of document or information that you've come across that has just kind of like blown your mind that you've just gotten really, really excited for?
So this one I showed you here, this I think is our most important document, this
hmm
letter of invitation from the Canadian government. But there's all sorts of interesting things that come across that I come across in the archives. Some of our oldest stuff is from the 1500s. Biggest item is a book. It's actually a Spanish Catholic music book.
Oh,
That's got to
cool.
be 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall, and weighs about 50 pounds. Covers are made of wood. Binding is made with metal hinges.
Mhm.
And it was used as a instead of off the wall singing where you project music on the wall, you'd stand in a semicircle around this music book and sing out of it. So it's not Mennonite at all, but we have it here as a way of, it's a teaching tool that people who talk about music history come and use it, but also people who talk about history of bookmaking or history of calligraphy and artistic design come and view this book. So I bring this book out a couple times every year. So that's a really cool thing. We have a book from 1551 that was used by a Mennonite midwife. That is a book of herbs. So not only does it list the plants, but also the medicinal values of this plant.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, so
That's
that's
definitely
neat.
something that can apply to modern life.
Yeah, yeah. And so some of the midwifery recipes that we've done some work with is really interesting stuff. I've done a fair amount of research on conscientious objectors, those in World War II who served Canada, but not with arms. They were working in forestry or in mining or in farming to support the government and the war effort. So that's a story I find interesting and not well known. There are over 10,000 people who served Canada without weapons in World War II. And those people came from 24 different communities, not Mennonite communities, different religious communities across the country.
hmm
So that's another interesting story that we have that I research.
Well, sounds like there's some really cool items over there.
Yeah, there are. If you like stories, this is the place to be.
So can can the general public visit the archive?
Yeah, absolutely. Now with COVID, we ask for people to make an appointment. So we kind of regulate who's coming in when. But yeah, the public is welcome to come on in. And the green screen I have behind me is part of my reading room. So this is what you see there is some of the periodicals that we have. And then there's that door you just see kind of off in the corner.
Yeah.
Go over
That
there.
one right there. Yeah.
Yeah. So behind that, we call that our vault. And behind there is, 1,600 square feet of vault space where we have these documents in boxes,
That's
documents in books, and all sorts of stuff.
Huh. Maybe I'm gonna have to plan a friend hangout to go visit the archive sometime because it sounds just like a really, really cool place.
Yeah, it is. I really enjoy it. I learn something old every day in my job. And it's always interesting to see what kind of questions people come to the archives with and want to answer. And it's fun being part of that research process. And when people come and say, I want to know something about this topic, then I got to think for a while. Okay, so how do I find that? Because archives are not arranged like a book.
hmm
To do archival research is different than doing book research or internet research. And because we don't have time to index everything. And so we have to create different ways of finding that information. We create contextual knowledge about the records. And so sometimes it takes a while to figure out, okay, how do you get at that question? And sometimes people are surprised that, well, you don't have anything on that, or you can't just pull that off the shelf. Like if someone wanted to find out, I want to do some research on tractors. I don't have a box on tractors.
Tractors.
Right?
Yeah, you got to go in. It develops your problem solving and investigative skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, very true.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Conrad. It was great speaking with you, and hopefully we can inspire some people to come and check out the archives.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on in. We're open Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. Check out our website. We're on Instagram and Facebook as well.
Hey, you enjoying the content from You Multicultural? Why don't you subscribe to stay up to date with everything that we're doing? We also have some amazing content. We also have EthnoFest coming later this summer, so you don't want to miss that. I'm Ryan Funk. This was You Talk, and have yourself a good one.